The Building of Global Empires, New Imperialism in the 19th Century. Lecture terms. We talked about imperialism or European expansion back in the 15th and 16th centuries. Today we're going to talk about the characteristics of new imperialism in the 19th century, a new wave of expansion from the Western nations took place in the 19th century. And these characteristics are common. They are shared by all of the Western states who participated in this process. The characteristics of new imperialism that all of the Western nations that participate in the process in the 19th century share are the motivations and the justifications for this imperialism. Let's talk about the motives first. Military. There were strategic footholds and waterways, as well as some areas that could be supply stations, not just for the navies, but also supply areas for the industrialization in the mother countries. This will lead to increased imperial rivalries over these strategic territories. And as we move closer to the 20th century, we'll talk more about how these imperial rivalries get more and more heated and actually become one of the factors leading up to World War I. We also see military motives are also coupled with political motives. Domestically at home, the crises that were associated with industrialization eventually gave way to a push to find another outlet for those pressures. Pressure from socialism, as more and more of the working class poor are agitating for changes. Imperial policies, grabbing onto territories and areas that are known more as third world territories. These imperial policies distract the proletariats from the domestic politics that are going on. And ultimately it became something that all of the nations that participated in it, the citizens in those nations, could rally around. For example, the folks in the British Empire, even though the working class poor might not have a lot at home, they always saw themselves as being a part of something greater. They were better off than the native populations that Great Britain was controlling in the empire. So it became somewhat of a vote getter. And you can see evidence of this, especially when you look at Great Britain and the politics going on in the 19th century between the more conservative factions and liberal factions in the British Parliament. Cecil Rhodes, a great British imperialist and British businessman, basically argued that imperialism was a good alternative to civil war because it funneled the friction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie or the capitalists into something elsewhere, into imperialism. There are also economic motives. Industrialization and capitalism, as I have said, were a major push for this new wave of imperialism. First of all, the discovery of natural resources needed for industry was something that motivated the expansion into these territories, especially in Africa and Asia. Africa had not really been penetrated by explorers farther than the coastline. We talked about that earlier with the 16th century exploration of the African coastline. But pushing deeper into the interior did not really happen by very many Western nations until it was determined that there were natural resources there that could be used for industries back at home, since industrialization had happened. And not only were there natural resources that could be exploited, but also cheap labor to harvest these natural resources, like rubber and cotton and other resources that could be used to fuel the industries back at home. Not only could they get raw materials that they needed, the natural resources that they needed for industry back at home, but many businessmen also hoped that they could expand their markets by moving into these new territories. They hoped that they could eventually create customers out of the native populations where they were gaining these natural resources. They could harvest the natural resources, take them back home, produce them into manufactured goods, and then sell some of those goods back to the native populations. Unfortunately, this turned out to be rather limited. The expansion into creating new markets in these imperial territories was very limited. As an example to explain this, British trade with their colonies in the 19th century only totaled about 12% of their total trade. Their best trade partners were other industrialized states, other Western states, which is ironic because those states were the very ones that Great Britain was competing against for control over the new lands. It's counterintuitive that they were fighting with their best trade partners over who would acquire the majority of the territories, who would acquire these spheres of influence. But of course, they didn't see that at the time. Another motive was infrastructure and transportation as part of this. Steamships and railroads could be utilized in areas like the interior of Africa, going up and down the Nile River, building railroads. Of course, the Cape to Cairo Railroad comes to mind for the British to get goods, get those natural resources from one place to another to eventually get them back to the homeland. Infrastructure, as I said before, building of ways to get product to market more quickly. The Suez Canal was dug for the British between 1859 and 1869, and that made it easier for the British to get to India without having to go all the way around the tip of Africa. The Panama Canal will serve the same purpose for the United States over in the Americas as well, and that was built between 1904 and 1914. We'll talk more about that in a little while. Another thing that comes along with the economic motivations is, of course, weaponry. The advantage for the Western nations over the native populations was extensive, and this is largely due to industrialization. They were able to apply the industrial technology to the creation of new weapons, bigger, better, faster weapons that had ever been utilized before, and the native populations were not able to compete with those, and so they were very quickly overtaken. There were still some religious motivations. Now, in the 15th and 16th century imperial movements of the European expansion, we discussed the roles that missionaries played in those movements. Pacification of the native populations, so it made it easier for the mother country to come in and take over. We'll see a similar process happening in new imperialism in the 19th century, using missionaries to pacify the native populations. But we can also see that the religious justification for imperialism is strongly connected to the ideas that the Western nations felt that they had not only the right, but the duty to take these territories, like we saw with Manifest Destiny with the United States expansion westward. There's also demographic motivations. Using England as an example once again, criminal populations at home could be moved elsewhere. Australia, in particular, was founded by the British to be a penal colony. You can get rid of your dissident populations, remove them from your regular society, and send them elsewhere. These were all motives for new imperialism. Now we need, that were similar, of course, amongst all the Western nations, not just in Great Britain, but all the Western nations. We will use Great Britain quite a bit in this lecture as an example, but it's important that you realize that it is not just Great Britain that is involved in this process. I'm just using Great Britain as an example since they were one of the foremost imperial countries, created the largest empire that we saw of any nation during the 19th century. It was said that the sun never set on the British Empire during the 19th century. Great Britain controlled about 25% of the world's real estate by the end of the 19th century. Now, justifications for new imperialism were also very similar, no matter which Western nation we were talking about. And part of this goes to it can be explained by looking at the poem that you are reading this week by Rudyard Kipling. He lived from 1864 to 1936. He was a British poet and author who was very much pro-imperialism. And he wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden. And as you read it this week, you will note that he uses the word burden synonymously with duty. Take up the white man's burden. Also saying, take up your duty as a white man to civilize the world, to deliver civilization and Christianity to the world, etc. He saw this as the duty of not just the white man, but also the duty of the Western world to civilize the rest of the world, to make the rest of the world more like the West. And even though he tries to use language that will make it seem as if the Western world is doing a favor to the less civilized world, ultimately it smacks of paternalism and racism, as you will note by some of the other language that he uses. For example, referring to the native populations in some of these regions as, quote, half devil and half child. Anyhow, the white man's burden, this notion that it is the duty of the West to civilize the rest of the world, sometimes was really just a justification for the Western world being able to move in and justify their exploitation of the native populations that they were taking over. And of course the exploitation of the resources that they could get by taking these regions. And this will also lead to more justifications that smacked of racism, and even a kind of scientific racism. What I mean by this is there were some sociologists who actually used science as a justification for exploiting other races that they came into contact with as they imperialized the world. Gobineau, a French social scientist, wrote The Inequality of the Human Races in 1853. And in this book, he talked about there being a kind of ladder, a hierarchy, a ladder of races. And, of course, the lighter-skinned Western nations were at the top. And the more you go down the ladder, the darker the skin got, the more southern and eastern the populations got on the map. And ultimately, he claimed that the majority of the world's territory will be taken over by the lighter-skinned peoples because they are more dominant. They have the education, they have the technology that is needed to dominate the rest of the world. And of course, this does smack of racism once again. but it was still utilized as a justification for what they were doing. This also is connected to the science behind Darwin's Origin of the Species. He published his book, Origin of the Species, in 1859, and Darwin was a naturalist. He was a scientist who was studying nature and how things in nature seem to adapt over time in response to changes in the environment. Now, he was talking specifically about nature, plants and animals, but ultimately his ideas about genetic variants being passed along to offspring, allowing certain species to survive in a response to changes in the environment and other species to die out. These variants eventually were started. They were used as justifications for why the Western, quote, white men were able to take over the more indigenous populations that they were coming into contact with in places like Africa and Asia. So even that smacked a little bit of racism, but mostly it was utilized by social scientists like Spencer, who took some of Darwin's ideas out of context. Spencer's social Darwinism argued that just like Darwin said there were genetic variants that some species have that allow them to survive, and they can pass them along to their offspring, whereas other species don't have those genetic variants and they will die out, they will go extinct. Spencer argued that in the Western world in the 19th century, it was technology that was that variant. Since the Western world had harnessed technology with the Industrial Revolution, that was why the Western world would dominate the rest of the world and would be able to take over those indigenous populations and those territories. Now that we've discussed some of the generalizations of imperialism, the characteristics that all of the imperial nations shared, now let's talk a little bit about some examples of new imperialism across the globe. We're going to begin by looking at the British Empire, in particular the British Empire in India. The British were seen as trailblazers in India, largely because they had been there since the 17th century. India was under the British East India Company rule. They had developed a monopoly on Indian trade. They had been able to successfully dominate the Dutch who had come into the southern region. Originally, the British had permission from the last of the Mughal emperors that controlled the northern part of India, but after the death of Aurangzeb that we talked about earlier in 1707, the Mughal Empire declined. And ultimately, because Britain wanted to protect their economic interests through political conquests, they moved into India and declared that there was a doctrine of lapse in the area. That meant, since the Indian, quote, ruler produced no heir after the death of Aurangzeb, the company would take over to control the area upon the death of that last Mughal emperor. Now, in reality, there would still be, in some ways, the trappings of the emperorship, but he was mostly just seen as a figurehead from that point forward. And the British East India Company basically had control over India. Eventually, we will see the British government outright will come in and take control. And it really begins with the issue over the British and Indian troops that were in India called the sepoys. The sepoys are basically the Indian troops that were recruited by the British that would serve to protect the British East India Company interests in India. They utilized the local populations as much as they could to build up this protective force in India. But by 1857, there was a small-scale rebellion that eventually exploded to ignite general anti-British feelings in India. You see, the rifles that the British were now issuing to the sepoys were new rifles that they had developed because of industrialization back at home. And these new rifles had cartridges that were that were wrapped in wax paper that was greased with animal fat, both beef fat and pork fat. This was a problem for the Indian sepoys because those that were Hindu were not allowed to touch beef byproducts. Those who were Muslim were not allowed to touch pork product. And in order to get the cartridge into the rifle, not only did they have to touch it to unwrap it from the wax paper, but they also had to bite off the end before they could put it in the gun, which would cause them to ingest some of that animal fat. This will lead to a rebellion that ignited general anti-British feelings. The British will respond, this happens in 1857, by moving in and formally abolishing the Mughal Empire, abolishing the East India Company control over the area, and ultimately the British government moves in and establishes direct rule over India. Similarly, in other parts of Asia, you can see the competition that became more and more heightened between Western nations over who would get what territories. In Central Asia, we see this competition between Western nations referred to as the Great Game. In particular, when you look at the rivalry that developed between the Russians and the British over territories in Afghanistan. The Russians became more active in this region of Central area in the 1860s. And these were areas that were getting a little too close for comfort to India for the British palate. Eventually, the British and the Russians will virtually come to blows over who will control Afghanistan. This is area to the north of India, and eventually this will lead to a conflict between the two. What will forestall an outright war between these two is, first of all, World War I, and then second of all, the Russian Revolution in 1917 at the end of World War I. This will forestall an outright war between these two nations because they recognize that they both have interests in thwarting Germany more than they do in their problems with each other. So ultimately in World War I, they put their differences aside in order to ally against Germany. We'll talk more about the different alliances leading up to World War I in a later lecture. But this just goes to show you that these little military fracases between Western nations over these imperial territories, over these spheres of interest, spheres of influence, these will be dress rehearsals in some cases, getting the Europeans, the Western nations, ready for an outright world war that will come soon after. In Southeast Asia, we see other areas that were gobbled up by Western nations. The Spanish, of course, had been in the Philippines. Of course, they will lose control of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, which we'll talk more about later. The Dutch were, of course, in Indonesia. The British had established a presence in the entire region of Southeast Asia, including Singapore and Malaysia, from the 1820s forward. The French, of course, taking over areas that they called French Indochina Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos between 1859 and 1893. So the entire region of Central and Southeast Asia was pretty much overrun by the Western nations by the end of the 19th century. The competition between Western nations over spheres of influence ultimately led to a virtual feeding frenzy to take territories wherever they could find them. Let the carving begin is a phrase that oftentimes refers to the scramble for territory among the Western nations in Africa. But it also, you can see, the spheres of influence beyond Africa were also treated the same way. This scramble for territory, this participation in this imperialism game becomes heightened as we move towards the middle to late 19th century. And it can ultimately lead to more and more competition between Western nations that leaves a climate ripe for war. By the time we move into the late 19th century, Africa became more of a region that people wanted to push deeper into the interior of. Adventurers, after the end of the slave trade, after the slave trade was outlawed, they began to push deeper into Africa in search of other goods, ivory and gold in particular. And once ivory and gold were found, a virtual scramble for territory began between the Western nations over who would control what. And I think the picture that I have on this slide clearly illustrates this scramble, this land grab that the Western nations participated in. So you can see the coupling of extreme nationalism back at home in the Western nations, as well as competition between themselves and rival nations, will lead to this big land grab. Land, after all, does equal power. The more land your nation controls, the more clout your nation has on the world stage. And this will become a factor as we move closer to World War I at the beginning of the 20th century. Another thing that they found as they pushed more into the interior of Africa was the Europeans found that there were useful resources that could be found deeper in Africa if they used the rivers to help them explore those regions. By pushing deeper into the interior of Africa, for example, they found rubber. Rubber became a very important product when it came to manufactured goods in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they would, of course, rubber would be invaluable to the automobile industry as we move closer to the 20th century. Now, I have some examples of what happened in Africa with this land grab, with this scramble for territory. And we're going to focus on the Belgians and the English competing for dominance over the interior of Africa, what they refer to as, quote, the dark continent, meaning the unknown continent. Great Britain had established a strong presence in northern Africa early on, taking over Egypt. They utilized Egypt to harvest cotton that they could use for their textile industry. But they also will push deeper beyond Egypt by using the Nile River, pushing deep into the heart of Africa. And one particular British businessman, Cecil Rhodes, that I mentioned before, established his own territory for his own businesses called Rhodesia. And this area was flowing with gold and diamonds. And a great deal of the diamonds that exist in the world today come from this region still. The Suez Canal was something that was dug by the British after they gained control over Egypt, so they could have a more direct route to India, their other colonies in India and in Southeast Asia. by digging the Suez Canal through territories they controlled in Egypt and northern Africa. They no longer had to go all the way around the tip of Africa to get to those other colonies. So that was good for business as well. The French will compete with Great Britain in northern Africa as well. They establish a presence in Morocco. And there will be some elbows being thrown at each other, if you will, metaphorical elbows thrown at each other between Great Britain and France over who will dominate northern Africa for quite some time. Again, they will eventually put their differences aside to concentrate on who they see as the common problem, the rise of Imperial Germany. Germany will eventually start to elbow their way in to both British and French territories in Africa after they unify in 1871. Because Germany was later a latecomer to the imperial land grab game, they are willing to use military force to try to force their way into taking some of the better territories away from nations that were already there. And again, this will be another factor leading up to World War I that we'll discuss more in detail as we move to that lecture. Now, the Belgians eventually will push into the area known as the Congo. King Leopold II of Belgium started the Congo Free State in the late 1800s, and in 1908 it would be renamed the Belgian Congo. And of course, the area of the Congo was known for the resource of rubber that could be harvested there. So the Belgians will eventually dominate the trade in rubber. Now, to explain how the competition over land could lead to war, we're going to take a look at what happened in South Africa in a war called the Boer War that happens between 1899 and 1902 between the Dutch, who had already established a presence in southern Africa way back in the 17th century, and the British, who are trying to gain control over South Africa in the 19th century. This is one example of these small military fracases between nations squabbling over spheres of influence in the imperial territories. These small fracases are just a dress rehearsal for all-out war that could happen as we move towards World War I in the 20th century. Now, the Dutch, as we know, the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, established a foothold in southern Africa back in 1652 as they came to dominate that region, taking it away from Portugal, eventually dominating southern India as well. And some Dutch farmers will eventually migrate to South Africa to establish a colony there. Now, the Dutch did not normally establish colonies in their territories in the 17th century. They were more of a trading post empire, but this area around Cape Town was the exception to that rule. Farmers will eventually, they were known as Boers originally, but they were originally, they settled in this territory, and they would later rename themselves Afrikaners. And they even developed their own language, which was kind of a blending of the Dutch language and the native language of the South African territories that they were now moving into. They had a lot of competition and conflict with the indigenous peoples that they came into contact with in the 17th century, but eventually the Afrikaners, the Boers, were able to establish a settlement there, and they would remain there for many generations. In 1806, the British decide that they are going to move into this region and try to dominate it, taking it away from those Dutch settlers who had been there by this point for a century and a half. The Afrikaners do not appreciate the British moving into this area, and they try to resist. Eventually, they come to a kind of agreement. The British were able to tolerate the Afrikaners in that area, at least for a few generations. But eventually it will lead to more conflict as we move closer to the end of the 19th century. And it eventually erupts into an all-out war between the Afrikaners, or Boers, and the British. Between 1899 and 1902, there will be an all-out war between the Afrikaners and the British. The Afrikaners are forced to concede in 1902, and by 1910 they had integrated with the British, who controlled the region, into what will be called the Union of South Africa. It will be a British colony, but those Afrikaners were allowed to remain there if they became citizens of this British colony and recognized the governance of the British in that region. The British will remain in control of South Africa until the end of the 20th century, when finally they allow it to have self-rule, and Nelson Mandela was a big part of that self-rule movement in South Africa back in the 70s and 80s, 1970s, 1980s. The competition over the lands in Africa eventually did lead to more and more military fracases between Western nations. And so in 1884, between 1884 and 1885, those Western nations attempted to try to find some sort of common ground, some sort of compromise, by calling the Berlin West Africa Conference. 14 European states and the United States attended the conference. No African states or native populations were invited to attend. But the rules of colonization were established at this conference. Basically, it was decided by these 15 Western nations that how they would carve up Africa into spheres of influence between those 15 nations. The native populations were not considered at all in what they wanted. Again, this shows you the paternalism and the racism that commonly is associated with imperialism. The rules were established. Any European state was recognized to be able to take any, quote, unoccupied territory after they informed the other European powers that they were doing so. Now, sometimes there would still be friction, because it would sometimes they would have a disagreement over whether territories were unoccupied or not. Some Western nations had laid claim to territories but had not officially moved in, when it came to colonies or establishing colonies or even military outposts. Just claiming a territory as yours would not be recognized as the same as actually occupying a territory. European firepower will come to dominate Africa after the Berlin West Africa Conference. And most of the native populations will be completely overrun by these Western colonies being established by these Western nations. The exceptions were a couple that are to be noted. Ethiopia. In 1896, the native Ethiopian population fought off the Italian advance. The Italians were trying to imperialize and take over Ethiopia to colonize it. And the native Ethiopians were able to fend off the Italian advance. This was a huge blow to the Italian ego. They will eventually move in and take over the area prior to World War II, but that will be another generation away. Liberia was another exception. Part of the negotiations that happened with the United States at the Berlin West Africa Conference was that Liberia would become a dependency of the United States. and the United States were able to basically dominate Liberia without any kind of military takeover because of this agreement made here. After carving up Africa, of course, the European imperialism will eventually move further east and push into the Pacific, using Southeast Asia that had already been taken over as a starting point. Europeans will continue to establish commercial outposts throughout the southern Pacific regions in the Pacific Islands. As I mentioned before, the British used Australia as a penal colony from 1788 on. Eventually, voluntary migrants follow as gold was discovered in 1851. New Zealand as well. Now, as more and more British move into these areas, they will also bring with them diseases that will devastate the native populations of these regions. The British did not see this as a problem because they considered the territories of Australia and New Zealand what they called terra nullius, land belonging to no one. So the native populations were forced to sign treaties. The Treaty of Waitangi of 1840 placed New Zealand under British, quote, protection. And then in 1851, as gold was discovered in these regions, more and more people move in, and eventually the entire region becomes part of the greater British Empire. As discussed earlier, the United States was also part of the imperialism game as we move into the 19th century. It really begins with Manifest Destiny at the beginning of the 19th century. But after Manifest Destiny was achieved in the North American continent, it continues. The United States imperialism eventually becomes a big part of the foreign policy of many of the presidents of the 19th century. The Monroe Doctrine probably is the best example of how this became a goal for the United States of gaining access to more territories. President James Monroe warned the Europeans with his writing of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, warning them not to engage in imperialism in trying to take territories in the Western Hemisphere. Basically, the Monroe Doctrine said, European nations, do not try to take territories in the Western Hemisphere because we, the United States, see that as our territory to exploit. So from 1823 on, any European nations that tried to involve themselves in matters going on in the Western Hemisphere found themselves at war oftentimes with the United States, or at least in some kind of military fracas. This also gave the United States justification for gaining more territory in the Western Hemisphere. In 1867, the United States purchased the Alaska Territory from Russia. In 1875, the United States established a protectorate over Hawaii that was taken away from the British. And, of course, some of the imperial efforts will lead to war with other countries. What is sometimes referred to as the Spanish-American War, but what your textbook refers to as the Spanish-Cuban-American War, happens between 1898 and 1899. And ultimately, this was when the United States declared war on Spain after one United States battleship, the Maine, was sunk in Havana Harbor. This happened in 1898, and the Spanish, who had occupied Cuba since 1492, ultimately will lose control of that region when the United States declares war in the Spanish-American War. By the end of the war, the United States took possession of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, all territories that had belonged to Spain since the late 15th, early 16th century. The United States will use the Monroe Doctrine as their justification for moving into these territories. The United States will also intervene in other Caribbean and Central American lands. And eventually, the United States will occupy the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Haiti. President Theodore Roosevelt was the hero of the Spanish-Cuban-American War. And he will eventually use that popularity to push him into position of power to even become president. He was in office between 1901 and 1909, and he supported an insurrection against Colombia in 1903, and this prompted him to add what was called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. In Colombia, the insurrection against the Colombian authorities the rebels were supported by the United States because the United States, under President Theodore Roosevelt, wanted to establish a foothold in the territory of Panama. You see, we wanted to dig the Panama Canal, again, to get goods from the eastern side of our nation to the western side of our nation without having to go all the way around the tip of South America. We supported the rebels, and in exchange for our support, we gained territory to build the Panama Canal. The Roosevelt Corollary of the Monroe Doctrine was then written to state not only what the Monroe Doctrine originally said, but also it stated that the United States had the right to intervene in domestic affairs of other nations if the United States investments were threatened. How did we justify supporting the rebels against the Colombian government? Through the Roosevelt Corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. We saw it as threatening our investments if the Colombian authorities remained in control of Panama. So therefore, that's how we justified our involvement in that region. And the byproduct, we gained control over Panama so we could dig our canal. The final example of imperialism that I want to give you today is early Japanese expansion as it happens in the 19th century. There was a great deal of resentment over the unequal treaties of the 1860s, which ultimately gave Western nations a lot of control over spheres of influence in China. The Japanese felt as if they should also have economic interests in those areas in Asia. They also did not like the fact that all of those Western nations throughout the end of the 19th century started to gobble up territory in Central and Southeast Asia. These were territories also that Japan felt that they should be able to exploit. So in the 1870s, the Japanese colonized some northern territories and some island territories in Asia. By 1876, the Japanese were able to purchase warships from Great Britain so they could then move in and dominate Korea. Eventually, the Japanese will be able to use those warships to build up their own navy. And by the end of the 19th century, they will participate in a couple of wars that they will dominate, and they will be able to take territories away from China and Russia as a result. The first one was the Sino-Japanese War, 1894 through 95. The fight was between Japan and China over Korea, and it results in a Japanese victory. So they can not only dominate economically Korea, but by this point they dominate it politically as well. In 1904 to 1905, the Russo-Japanese War was fought between Japan and Russia over territories that Russia controlled in Asia. And this also ended with a Japanese victory. This was a huge blow to the ego of the Russians and will be one more example of the failure of Russia to westernize will leave them weak in the eyes of many nations in the world at the dawn of the 20th century. And this will become increasingly problematic for the Russians as we move into World War I, especially problematic for the Russian leadership under the Romanov czars. We'll talk more specifically about the implications of the Russo-Japanese War for the Russian czars in a later lecture. In the next series of lectures, as we build up to World War I and fight World War I, we'll talk more specifically also about how all of this competition for these nations, for these territories in the imperial areas of the world, becomes a factor leading to warfare. So more on those implications as we move forward. Thank you.